why this leads to better feminist advocacy on our side, and thirdly, why this leads to the feminist movement doing less harm. Let's start with buy-in. This team might say there's a group of women who have been harmed by feminism, and in order to get them to buy in, we need to include anger in our advocacy. First of all, most women have internalized narratives that the majority of society have pushed to them, and that they don't have that same degree of high levels of anger, because they don't see it that way. They've been internalized into these structures within society. Secondly, this is about feminist advocacy, not about everything that feminists do. So feminist organizations want to bring in people who feel an incredibly high degree of anger, then we're still able to set up other systems for them to discharge that anger. Thirdly, we can explain to these women that this is not a helpful way of doing it. We can explain to them that yes, we are angry, but we need to make a rational choice about how it is that we can best do it. And fourthly, even if there are a set of incredibly angry women, we would say that those women are unlikely to want to externalize that anger in a way that potentially puts them in danger, in a way that makes those interactions bad. They're probably more likely to value their own safety in their advocacy. Yes?
Do you think that slavery should be confrontational to slavery? Slaves have internalized feelings of...
Slavery and feminism in the modern day are different political issues that require different approaches, disanalogous. Why is it that this is likely to get substantially more buy-in? First, we get more buy-in from women on our side. Firstly, because women are socialized not to be confrontational. They're socialized by media depictions, by their parents, by social conditioning in their social circles growing up, which means they're probably not going to want to buy into a movement that is confrontational, that frames them as confrontational, makes people see them as confrontational, and requires them to be confrontational in their micro-advocacy. Secondly, they're told not to by men in their lives, particularly in socially conservative areas. It becomes socially unacceptable to be a part of the feminist movement, because many women care about their relationships with men and don't want to imperil them by being seen as confrontational. But thirdly, because now, if you're going to engage in micro-feminist advocacy yourself, you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation where you have to be adversarial, which is something you're not likely to want to do. But next, you also get less buy-in from men. And for a small minority of men, you get them hyper-radicalized. That looks like them going to things like Andrew Tate. That looks like them becoming, manosphere, MRA, completely anti-women. We think that is an enormous harm on itself. But even for the majority of men who aren't as radicalized as that, it's quite a large harm. First of all, men don't like being told that they're wrong and bad and evil. Secondly, this doesn't align with their personal experience, because they think I'm not hyper-privileged, I've had struggles in my life, and they don't understand the relative distinction between that and a woman in the same situation. But it doesn't align with their intuitive version of their personal experience, so they're unlikely to buy into it. Third of all, you then require them to get defensive, so you actually negatively polarize them into a more anti-feminist position, because they feel the necessity to defend their own actions, which means that they then need to explain why the complaints of the women are wrong. It also becomes more opposed by political parties, because, and obviously particularly conservative political parties, and obviously conservative political parties will on either side oppose feminism, but there's clearly a margin here. A more aggressive form of feminism that says men are bad not only gets more attack from conservative political parties, but makes it easier for those conservative political parties to explain why they aren't on side with that feminism for the reason that it is aggressive, that it is anti-men. You're less likely to get buy-in from political parties when it's overly controversial. That means you're less likely to be brought in as a feminist special interest group to policy discussions. That means that the political party is less likely to bring you into their policy platform, and that's even for left or right-wing political parties. And this justifies counter-escalation against it. And I'll note here that you're now more likely to believe incorrectly that feminism is anti-men, which explains why it becomes substantially less palatable. I'll also note here, by being aggressive and adversarial, you make yourself into a less palatable political movement, which means that you can't be brought into spaces that aren't ready for confrontation. Things like you can't get spots at luncheons, you can't get spots on morning TV, because politeness culture means people don't want to bring you in. I'd also note that this alienates specifically the most vulnerable women, the people with the most internalized misogyny in the most conservative areas, to whom the feminist movement owes the greatest obligation, because they're the most held back by the patriarchy. They're the most likely to be the victims of men, because they're around the most conservative and pernicious men. They're the least equipped to deal with the problems, because they haven't had as much exposure from the feminist movement. So set women who are the most confrontation averse are the most important ones to whom we owe this obligation. Second argument, here's why we get a better feminist movement that works better. First of all, I'll note that being adversarial misdirects blame, because most problems can't be blamed on a specific person. They're broad systemic problems, but when you say that blame is what we're looking for, you're looking for a clear source against which you can discharge that blame. So, when you are finding a source to discharge that blame, it's very difficult to do so against amorphous structures, and you're more likely to oversimplify the problem such that it can be simplified to be blamed on a unit to which you can discharge blame, which means that we don't get as much good discussion in the feminist movement, because it becomes enough to shame men that is a form of catharsis on and of itself, as opposed to dealing with it. And it frames feminism as anti-men, which it shouldn't. Feminism should also liberate men against, for instance, the expectations of masculinity that make their lives worse. A feminist movement that is anti-men and pro-women is worse than one that is pro-man and pro-women. It also means that discussion becomes substantially less viable because problems are complex, they require complicated discussion, and when discussions become more highly emotional, they're less likely to be highly logical and discuss the intricacies of that problem. It becomes harder to actually have reasoned debate because everyone just has to maximize their level of anger, which means that those discussions get worse. And it buys into the belief that women shouldn't be taken seriously because they're too emotional, because those women don't have the capacity to engage in public policy discussion. Finally, this now means that feminism simply does less harm. I'll note here that this is a much more certain benefit because we don't know how much feminist advocacy will work, and feminist movements often advocate for really bad things. They're super trans, and they often direct that shame and adversarialism at the most disprivileged groups, at other women who are seen as having more responsibility, at trans people who they feel are taking authorities because these have been co-opted by white people and corporate interests. And the harm here